Hey there, this is Elena with Black Sheep 303 Creative, and today I am very happy to be offering you a sneak peek at some of the stamps that Elizabeth Craft Designs is going to be releasing probably in early February. You may or may not know that I am on the Elizabeth Craft Designs coloring design team this year, and as a result, I have been given an opportunity to work with the new stamps that are coming out from them. They are best known probably for their dies. They have some amazing, really cool interactive dies. And they have had stamps in the past, and those were great. But now they have decided to really expand out their line of stamps and come out with a bunch of new ones that are specifically designed with coloring in mind. So for this project, I used a flower from one set, which will be called the Flower Power stamp set. And then I used a leaf from a different stamp set, which is the Spring Bloom stamp set. Now, I did want to mention that this release of stamp sets is going to have something for everybody. There's not just flowers. They have dogs and cats and woodland creatures and jungle creatures and teddy bears and oh, you name it. There's something for everybody. So keep an eye on the Elizabeth Craft Designs coming soon page, because I'm sure they will have some cool pictures up there in the next few weeks. And you could also check with some of the other coloring design team members, as I'm sure they will have sneak peeks up on their blogs as well. But for this card, I decided to just work with this big floral image, which I loved. And I used a lot of masking and rotated this stamp around to get 4 blooms on this side of my card piece here, and stamped it all in archival ink, so it's waterproof, because I knew I wanted to work with my Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers and some water. And then I also masked off the flower to stamp the little leaves here and there as needed. So I have a few tips for you as far as working with zigs, or really anything watercolory related, like especially markers and watercolor. I'm speeding up the coloring quite a bit because there's a lot of coloring for this, and you'd be here for an hour if we watched this in real time. So hopefully you can follow along as I color and while I explain kind of how, or the sort of things that I do to make this work well, at least for me. So for the flowers, I am only using one color of marker. I'm using the 82 purple. And although it's called purple, it is really much more of a fuchsia. It's like a very pink purple. And I wanted very, very vibrant flowers, so I used a lot of color and water to basically create the variation in tone on each petal. So probably the most important thing I have learned is that if I want to make sure that each petal is separate from the petal next to it, I don't want to work on 2 petals that are right next to each other at the same time. Because what I'm doing is using water to spread the color out. And if I have one petal that's wet with color in it, and I wet the petal that's right next to it, the water acts as a conduit for the color. The water is sort of like, here's a pathway that the color can go on. So if one petal's done and I wet the one that's right next to it, and so they're both wet, the color is going to flow from the one I've finished right into the new one that's wet now. And usually that kind of wreaks havoc on the shading that you've done and kind of becomes a big sort of medium tone mess generally, and really messes up your ability to keep the petals looking separate from each other. So that's why in this first part, you could see I worked on like one petal, then I left a white space, then I went to another petal, left a white space, and then went to another petal. And then now, as I'm going into petals that are adjacent to those ones that have already been done, that's because the ones that I already did are now dry. And so the water won't, once it's dry, it's not going to try to get into those areas. So that's something that works very well for me. The second thing I did in terms of shading was I wasn't really worried too much about light source or anything. I was just kind of going with the flower was going to be darker towards the middle and lighter towards the outer petals. And then any petal that's underneath another petal, like some of these ones I'm doing now, is going to be darker than the petals on top of it. So that was a really easy way to create separation in terms of color from one petal to the next petal. And then any area where the petal turns over, like you see the underside of the flower, and there are quite a few areas on this stamp where you do see that, I decided those were going to be the absolute lightest parts of the flower. So I left those till the absolute very end to color in, and then I used almost no color and mostly water to color those in and give them just the slightest hint of pink. And then another thing that I've learned works really well for me is having a cloth on hand, like a dry cloth. So for this project, what I use is a baby wipe that has just dried out. And I take that, and when I use too much water or I use too much color, that kind of helps me correct the problem. So let's say I put a bunch of color on a petal, kind of like I'm doing right now, and I add water, and then the whole thing just becomes one, like sort of the same shade of pink all over it. There's no variation between dark and light, and that's not what I'm going for. Probably because I've either got too much water, and so the colors just kind of spread evenly throughout the whole thing, or I added too much marker, and so the whole thing got too dark. So I'll take my dry cloth and I'll add some extra water to like the outer edges if I need it, or if it's really super wet, then it's already got enough. And I will just dab off the water that's on the outer edges of the petals to pull the water and the color off. And then that creates lighter sections just by doing that. Like it kind of erases the color, sort of. It doesn't completely take it off, but it definitely lightens it out significantly. And I don't have to do that for every petal, but it definitely has saved me many times when I have made mistakes in terms of like adding too much color or too much water. And so I would strongly encourage you to have a dry cloth on hand to do that. And especially like here I'm doing those folded over petals. It was pretty hard to get the color to be as light as I wanted it. And so that cloth helped a lot when I drew it and it was too dark, or the color I used was too dark. And so I would just dab the water off and it was lighten it up perfectly right away. And there is a supply list linked in the video description below. So if you want to know the specific colors I used for each thing, that is available for you, as well as all of the other supplies that I'll be using to complete the card. And the final thing that I did for this in terms of the zigs was I took a sort of a blue-gray marker and I went along the edge of the flowers all along here, as you'll see me doing right now. And so I just draw like a line right along the edge of the flowers, and then I take my water and I pull the color out into the white cardstock and till it's nothing. So it just fades away to nothing. And it creates just the tiniest bit of subtle dimension right along the edge of the flowers that really separate it out from the background and kind of add that extra sort of dimensional effect. And this is an idea I got from Kathy Rakusin, who I saw her do this with Copics, and I thought, that's brilliant. I'm going to try it with my zigs, and it worked like a charm. It worked really, really well. Now you can see the centers of these flowers are getting a little lost. So what I do wind up doing is taking my black glaze pen and going over the centers, just kind of like dotting over the centers as they are stamped, kind of as they're already designed. I just reinforce the dots that are drawn in the stamp to kind of emphasize and give a little extra dimension to those middles, since they were kind of getting lost a bit in all that vibrant color. Now for my greeting, I die cut this out using the dotted scallop squares dies. And then I cut out a rectangular, like a backing piece from my floral panel out of the dotted scallop. So these are the dotted scallop rectangles. The greeting was done with the dotted scallop squares. I did pop my greeting up with a little bit of foam tape, and then I'm going to adhere this entire panel down to a card base I have created using the pewter cardstock from Elizabeth Craft Designs, and I have made this slightly bigger than an A2 size. So the pewter card base is 4 3/8 by 5 5/8, because that dotted scallop rectangle is actually A2 size, which is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I wanted like just the tiniest little 1/16 of an inch border all the way around that scalloped rectangle just to finish it off. I just thought it needed just that little extra bit of gray to finish it off and kind of pull the gray from that little bit of edging I did along the flowers. And so I adhered all of this down, and now I'm going to be adding just the tiniest bit of sequins. And these sequins are from Little Things by Lucy's Cards. They're these tiny, tiny little hearts, and then there's some bigger hearts and some clear sequins. And they added just the right amount of Valentine-y touch to the card, I thought. And these tweezers that I'm using are also from Elizabeth Craft Designs, and I just can't say enough good stuff about them. They're amazing. They're like the tiniest little tweezer tips. Like they will grab the tiniest thing. And so it was super easy to work with them using these really small sequins and dipping them in the multimedia matte adhesive to get them down onto the card, because they're just like so narrow and so fine. It's really easy to pick up the tiniest little elements. So if you need some tweezers, I would highly recommend those. But that is basically the completed project. And hopefully you've gotten some tips from me on how to work well with zigs. And actually those techniques work with pretty much any kind of watercolor marker with watercolor that you might try to do. And there's a good close-up look at some of the coloring. And you can see how cool those stamps are. So I'm hoping you're getting as excited as I am for the release of all the cool new Elizabeth Craft Designs stamps. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. As I mentioned, there is a link to the video or the supply list in the video description below and on my blog. If you liked the video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on Instagram at blacksheep303. I also love questions, thoughts, comments, anything. So I'd love to hear from you, and leave me a comment below. Thanks so much. Have a great day.